Coming up on Think Out Loud. You're listening to Think Out Loud. I'm Dave Dillard in for Emily Harris. We turn now to Oregon history, and more specifically, what middle schoolers should be taught about it. Senator Joanne Verger has a bill in the legislature right now that would require middle schoolers to learn about the most important people, places, and events in Oregon's history. Senator Verger's bill got us wondering, what would you include in an Oregon Studies syllabus, and how would you teach it? Our website is opb.org/thinkoutloud. You can call us at 1-888-665-5865. Joanne Verger joins us now to talk about the bill. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
So start us off by telling us what fourth graders are learning right now, or what elementary school students are learning right now.
Well, it depends on which school you attend. Many transformational teachers just do a great job in teaching Oregon history. Many of them do a play. Some of them talk about the Oregon Trail. It is a required course, but it's not required to really teach it for any length of time. So it really is determined by the teacher, I think, as to what kind of presentation you make. And some teachers do a great job. Some teachers have, I think through time constraints, are not able to do as good a job.
I have the social sciences benchmarks that the Oregon Department of Education puts out for what they want students to learn in terms of state and local history. The fifth grade benchmark is basically the significant people in the history of Oregon from prehistory through the period of the American Revolution and some of the events up till that point. And then for eighth grade, it's everything from after the Revolution till 1900. For high school, it's 1900 onward. Mm-hmm. Are students not learning these things right now?
Well, the curriculum is going to change. Also, they've been working on it. They would take a little piece of it at each time. What Senate Bill 602, it changes that. It requires that the studies be taught as a course for 2 semesters. Currently, 33 states teach their state's history. 17 of those 33 teach it in middle school or above as a course. 16 states offer it in more than one grade. I would hope that Oregon would do that. They now teach it in the 4th grade, and even though it's limited, I think it would be nice to teach it then. By the time they get into middle school, now you're looking at a whole different set of studies for middle schoolers who can well understand when you talk about the Oregon Constitution and why it is the way it is, and why it is. It depends on the people that came here. The pioneers were the ones that didn't like government that much. They wanted a lot of public access and a lot of input into what happened in their government. But I think it's more important than that, because I believe that if you teach geography and civics and history as a full course for middle school students, you are building a process that later on these students are going to become more interested in their government, probably will end up in the legislature as Phil Lang, a former Speaker of the House, testified at my bill hearing, and he brought his 8th grade book on Oregon history, and he said that he was in Portland School and that it was the beginning of his interest, and he believes had a direct influence. Now, I believe it will influence pro-government thinking as well.
I want to get back to this pro-government idea, but before that, you're talking about shaping the future right now. When you grew up in Louisiana, is that right?
I did.
So how much did you learn about Louisiana state history when you were in school?
I had to have Louisiana history in order to graduate from high school. It was taught in high school. It was taught for a full year. And, Louisiana had a really checkered history politically. And that was taught to us very clearly, exactly why some of the people in Louisiana history ended up in the penitentiary and why it was wrong. But we learned a lot of civic pride in the state of Louisiana.
How did that affect you? I mean, you've now been in politics for a long time.
I think it had a direct effect on me. I think it led to a college minor in political science. I think it led me into public life. in Oregon, and I've been there 20 years now in elected positions. And so I think it had a direct effect on how I saw the importance of my participation in government and where you stand for the right thing and try to do the right thing and have moral courage in the political arena.
I'd like to take a call. Steve is with us from Portland. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, go ahead.
Yeah. So I have to first of all say that I agree that there's certainly a place for teaching about morality and culture. And I'll say that I have a 6th and 8th grader who attend public school here in Portland area.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to them a little bit about what do they learn, and they give very concrete examples about going to the Oregon Trail Museum, learning about Lewis and Clark, talking about history. And I know that the history, the standards that they have for social studies, Oregon is focused on in the 3rd and 4th grades. And then they cycle back throughout. So I don't feel that they're not getting an education in that. I guess my concern is I don't want them to lose out on the world history, the U.S. history. And I think we can teach all of the pieces that you just talked about through that. But there are really a lot of other pressing issues around, if you look at our 4-year cohort graduation rates in Oregon, if you look at the assessment policies that the students have to meet, when you're looking at mobility, students are going to leave. While I think there's a place for this, teaching kids about helping them get the academics, dealing with issues around economic literacy, and if we really want to tackle legislation, looking at things like the Pathways to Prosperity through Harvard just came out with a report where they're looking at multiple pathways and trying to change how we teach.
Steve, we got it. And I want to let Joanne Verger respond to that. I mean, in a sense, he's saying that there are, I think, if I can paraphrase, a limited number of hours and a lot of things that we're requiring of teachers and of students. And what about taking away from even just staying on history, as Steve said, U.S. or world history because you want to push more for local or state history?
I would not take away from U.S. history at all. 5th grade does a really good job with U.S. history, and I think world history is extremely important. We ran a test for 100 students in one of the high schools just to see about what they knew. The percentages were very low. For instance, 0% knew who the first woman governor of Oregon was. 26% knew the identity of the man, and actually it was a vice presidential candidate in Oregon history, a very famous Oregonian, and their high school was named for him, and only 26% knew that he existed. I think if my experience in being a guest speaker in the high schools was a strong motivation for this bill. I found that when I questioned them, and it depends on the school, I have to say, there are some schools that simply do a better job, but out of the 100 students that we tested here at a high school in Salem, the percentages were extremely disappointing about their knowledge of Oregon.
But so as you said, you don't want to take anything away from what's already being taught, but if you're adding 2 semesters of a new class, doesn't something have to give?
No, because it's already a required course in the curriculum.
Oregon history is?
They just have chosen to teach it in the 4th grade. And one of the things that I have offered as a compromise, in other words, if it meant passing the bill or not, I would be more than willing to have this bill go at 1 semester rather than 2.
I just want to make sure that I understand the bill. You're saying that it's already required in 4th grade. Is the only change you're proposing to that you want to require it in middle school instead of in 4th grade?
And I want it required that you teach it in middle school. I would hope that there would be some, and since it's such a small part of the 4th grade curriculum, that teachers or school boards, this is individual school districts can decide some things. I would hope that they would teach it somewhat in the 4th grade. But I do believe that at middle school it's more effective because I think they will remember it longer.
Eliza Canty-Jones is with us in the studio. Eliza Canty-Jones, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
So we brought you in because you're the editor of the Oregon Historical Quarterly, put out by the Oregon Historical Society. And we wanted to get your take on if you were starting from the beginning, which this build sort of gives us a chance to imagine, what should sixth graders be learning about Oregon history?
Okay, well, first I can say a lot about Oregon history, but not a lot about education and pedagogy. So I'll put that out there. But I think that starting at the beginning in Oregon means starting with Native peoples and then making sure to remember that Native peoples don't end once Lewis and Clark show up. And that's a really strong component of Oregon history. And I think just responding to the caller's concern about world history and U.S. history, my thinking is that you can teach Oregon history so that students get a better understanding of U.S. history and world history. I think a lot of us are more connected to history in the place where we are. It seems important to us. It seems real and relevant if it's connected to the physical place where we live. And I think that you can expand out from Oregon history to understand regional history and national history and global history in ways that are more relevant and tangible to students than they might be if it's separate from Oregon history. So I don't see these things as being separate.
Mm-hmm. You know, Joanne Verger, that reminds me, I mean, you want to concentrate state history in so that, let's say, a fifth or a sixth or a seventh grader gets, a concentrated 2-semester dose of it. Does that mean that you'd rather they learn about internment camps in that period as opposed to, built into a World War II lesson?
No, I think Oregon has such a unique history, and I believe that it starts with the Oregon Trail, and I think it has to be taught in how much is influence. We have the Indian population and their influence in history. We have the African American. In Coos Bay, where I live, the Chinese built the railroad. It has a very colorful, wonderful history. And Oregon stands out today as one of the progressive states in the United States. When I go to conferences and people see my name tag, they immediately want to talk about Oregon. I think that it's so exciting, I almost wish that I could go into schools and teach it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Oregon does have a really fascinating history, and it's a really complicated history. And I wouldn't begin with the Oregon Trail because there's so much more before that. There's, really thousands and thousands of years of history here before that. But I couldn't agree more that Oregon's history is so fascinating and on some level unique. What you have here is a place that for thousands of years was lived in and molded and shaped by a particular worldview. And then within really the past 225, 250 years has been influenced by a whole other kind of worldview. Now, this is something that is a global happening over the past 500 years, and we can see that in Oregon in some really specific and fascinating ways. And it is, the legislators bringing up all of these points about what a diverse population Oregon has had over the years, and that's absolutely true. And I think there needs to be more of that. You're talking about teaching students about the Constitution and the debates that were had over the Constitution. That's very important.
Absolutely.
And students should know that it's voters who decided that Oregon would not be a slave state and would also not allow black people to live here when they voted on that Constitution in 1857.
We got this from Britt, who wrote in our blog during a previous show we did about creating the Oregon Encyclopedia, this online Oregon Encyclopedia. Britt said it's important to cover what she calls Oregon's fascinating, disturbing, and largely ignored history of racism, racial discrimination, racist policies, and legislation. Let's bring in Sarah. Sarah is on the line from Portland. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hi there.
Hey, go ahead.
I'm walking away from my children.
Walk away from your children.
My experience of learning history in Oregon, what happened when I was in third grade and back in the late 70s or early 80s, and then my family moved to Montana for a few years. So when I was in seventh grade, I did Montana history. And I sure remember about the coin toss, to name Portland, and a little about Lewis and Clark. But what I really remember about state history comes from Montana. And Montana does, of course, share a lot of the history of Oregon because Lewis and Clark came through, and a lot of the same Native American tribes haunted both states. But it really made a much bigger impact on me. And now I ask my son, who's in third grade, in the third through fifth grade, so he has learned some in classrooms. So he has learned some Oregon history this year. I asked him what he's learned, and he says that he's learned a little bit about who the governor is, and then I asked him about the Oregon Trail, and he said, "Oh, well, I learned a lot about that from playing the game."
Yeah,
and that's pretty much all he knows.
Generation and a half of Americans. I grew up in Syracuse, New York, and the first time I ever heard about Oregon was that hilarious Oregon Trail video game in the early '80s. Sarah, you said that you learned a lot of Montana history, and it made an impact on you. What kind of impact did learning that state's history have on you that still carries through to this day?
Well, I think that there's a lot about just the sheer hardship of settling there, and how difficult it was to get through, for Lewis and Clark to get through Montana. And I learned, so many things about portaging and, all the mechanics of how you move around in a landscape. The whole history of, how the French settlers came in with the trapping and how people were looking for the Northwest Passage, and just that interaction between the native peoples and the settlers was really, it really struck me, and I still, have that feeling of, of kind of us, the white people, kind of tearing their way of life apart in this, unintentioned way that really, shaped our country in kind of this terrible and interesting way.
Sarah, thank you for sharing your story with us. Kristen is on the line from Portland. Kristen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, what do you want middle schoolers to learn about Oregon?
Well, I think particularly the age itself for middle schoolers. This is the age when they're really developing an identity and a sense of themselves and a sense of place in their own community. It's definitely an age when all of that is forming. And I think it's really important for them to understand what it really means to be an Oregonian and the full experience of that. And that's going to be grounded in that sense of history. It's going to be grounded in a sense of triumph with, the pioneers coming here and facing and overcoming hardship, to our environmental legislation, the bottle bill, up to the modern times of public beaches and our land use planning and all of that, plus the things that we really have to continue being aware of to prevent in the future: the treatment of Native Americans, the Exclusion Act, as Liza was talking about, the internment, as you mentioned, internment of Japanese Americans and what happened to their farms when they were interned, the realities of that. All of these things are going to shape, I think, as middle schoolers become more and more mature, their sense of how they can fit in to Oregon and what they can do in the future as civic participants, in terms of voting and participating in their own community, to not only celebrate the past, but figure out ways that they can prevent the mistakes of the past as well, and look to the future about what Oregon will be.
Kristen, thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of what the callers are saying about what a complicated and contested past Oregon has, and I think that is really important for kids and adults to learn. The important thing to learn about history is that nothing was inevitable. There were decisions made by people and actions taken by people, and they had consequences. And we have this wonderful 2020 hindsight benefit so that we can look back and say, what decisions were made? What consequences did they have? How has this played out? And with that understanding, then we do have better citizens, better able to make decisions today and think about, what might the consequences of this political decision or personal decision that we make be in the future? And that's why it's important. And that's why I suspect people are pushing to have some of this taught in the later grades as well as the earlier grades, because perhaps students are better able to understand some of that complexity and that critical thinking when they get a little bit older.
Joanne, Verger, this takes us back to what you said at the very beginning, which is that you think this kind of a class would make students more likely to become pro-government adults. What do you mean by that?
Well, I believe that there's the consequences of the past, and it's so important. These have been wonderful callers. I just greatly appreciate them. Sarah talked about being older when she was in Montana, and it has stayed with her. And I think that that's so important. And then the next caller talked about learning who you are and a sense of place and pride in Oregon. And then the past consequences. I think all of that fits right into Senate Bill 602. It is the reason that I've been so motivated and driven to try to get this thing through the process, because I believe that they actually told my story better than I could have.
So back to this question, though, of creating pro-government people. What do you mean by that?
I mean that when you have a sense of place, and when that uniqueness of history and what it has taken to get to where we are today, and the kind of decisions that we have made in Oregon, whether it's been in land use or the bottle bill, or some of the decisions we're making in this session, I think that people, and especially children at an older age, begin to get the idea of their place that can participate in the process and be a part of it. And I think that that's what it's all about. If you don't know any of these things and you don't understand the history, you're just living in a place but you don't know much about it, you aren't going to see the opportunities that are there for you as an individual to make a difference.
Joanne Verger and Eliza Canty-Jones, thank you so much for joining us.